Is war just an extension of politics? I ask myself that question often these days, more than I ever thought I would. It's not a rhetorical question, not some academic musing tossed around in lecture halls or political debates on television. No, it's a real question. Personal. It echoes in my chest like an unanswered prayer, quiet, heavy, and persistent. I live alone now, in a house that creaks with every gust of wind, on a road that barely sees a soul pass by. The paint on the walls is peeling, the garden has gone a little wild, and the flag I used to raise with pride hangs limp and frayed. It doesn't wave like it used to. It just hangs there, as tired as I am. I sit on the porch most mornings, sipping black coffee, listening to the stillness, and staring off into the horizon where the sunrise breaks like fire over the trees. And it's in those moments of soft, early light that the question comes back to me, like a whisper in the wind. Is war just politics by other means? I used to laugh at people who ask things like that. Back when I was still fresh-faced and uniformed, still filled with the noble idea that wars were fought for justice, for peace, for the protection of the innocent. I believed we were the sword against evil, the last line of defense. I looked up to generals the way children look up to superheroes, and I saw politics as a messy, dishonest business that was far removed from the blood and grit of war. Politicians lied. Soldiers fought. Simple division. But life has a way of peeling back your certainties like old wallpaper. The more time I spent out there, on the field, in the mud, under the rain of bullets, the more I began to feel the gap between what we were told and what we were doing. And when the war finally ended, not with a bang, not with victory, but with silence, I was left with that question sitting at the core of my soul, like shrapnel too deep to remove. I suppose I should introduce myself, but does a name matter in a story like this? I'm not looking for recognition. I'm just a man who went to war and came back. That in itself is rare. Some of my brothers never got that chance. Some never wanted it. Some came back in pieces, body or mind, and tried to stitch themselves back together in a world that no longer recognized them. When I came home, people called me a hero. They said things like, "Thank you for your service," and handed me commemorative coins and empty smiles. But when I asked them why we had gone in the first place, why so many had to die, their eyes darted away. They didn't have answers. Or maybe they had answers they didn't want to say aloud. There's something terrifying about realizing that your life, your pain, your scars, your nightmares, might have been the result of a decision made for convenience. That you were not fighting for something eternal or moral, but for leverage. For a negotiation. For an election cycle. That's what politics is, after all. It's about decisions, influence, optics. And sometimes, when those tactics fail, when diplomacy no longer serves the ambition of the powerful, the soldiers are sent in to carry the weight. We're taught to believe war is the failure of politics. But that's not quite true, is it? Because failure implies that someone tried to stop it. And the older I get, the more I realize that sometimes war isn't a failure. Sometimes it's a strategy, a continuation, a tool. Not because it solves problems, but because it resets the game. Because when talks break down and compromise becomes weakness, there's always the other means. But I didn't understand any of that when I first put on the uniform. I believed I was part of something sacred. I believed we were liberators. I believed the mission was pure. And I believed that my sacrifice, if it ever came to that, would be worth it. That belief stayed with me through basic training, through the first deployment, even through the first firefight. But beliefs don't survive reality unscathed. They crack, they wither, they change. And mine began to change the moment I saw what war actually was, not in speeches, but in shattered bones, burning homes, and children who stared at us like we were monsters. So here I am, years later, far from the battlefield, yet never really free of it. Every creak in this house, every gust of wind through the trees, every silence between breaths, those are the places where the war lives now. Not on a map, but in me. And that question, it keeps returning. Was it just politics in a uniform? I think I know the answer now. Or at least, I think I've come close to it. But if you have the time, I'd like to tell you the whole story. Not just the battles, but the moments between them. The conversations. The doubts. The things they never show in documentaries or recruitment ads. Maybe by the end of it, we can find the answer together. Because some truths are too heavy to carry alone. Part 2, The Seeds of War. Extended version. It didn't begin with bombs. It never does. People like to imagine that war starts with sirens, screaming jets, buildings crumbling into dust, but that's not how it really starts. No, war begins quietly. It creeps in like a chill under the door. It begins in whispers, in headlines, in silences. It begins when people stop asking questions. When words like national interest and security start replacing words like dialogue and humanity. War begins long before the first bullet is fired. I didn't understand that back then. The country was already a mess in those days. You could feel it in the streets. The mood had shifted, people were angrier, more divided, clinging to certainty like it was a life raft. The economy was limping. Prices had gone up, wages had stayed the same, and everyone was looking for someone to blame. They said it was the fault of international pressures, foreign meddling, unfair trade, those people across the border. Those words, those people, they started showing up more and more. Not just in newspapers, but in cafes, in family dinners, in late-night drunken conversations that turned a little too loud. It wasn't just talk. There were strategic leaks from anonymous officials. A convoy attacked here. A drone shot down there. Satellite images. Speculative diagrams. Vague threats. And always a sense of impending something. That was the feeling. Something is coming. Get ready. Brace. It was a tension you could taste in the air, like iron and static. And then came the speeches. The president started touring the country. Standing in front of flags and crowds, his voice always grave, always measured, as he spoke of defending our people, preserving national identity, and facing foreign aggression with courage. The words weren't fiery, not at first. They were slow, deliberate, like poison dripping into water. I remember one night, I was sitting on the cracked leather couch in our apartment, flipping channels. Every channel had the same thing, the president's face, tight-lipped, standing beside uniformed generals, with the flag behind them just slightly wrinkled, like they wanted it to look real. I was eating leftover noodles. I stopped mid-bite when he said it. We have exhausted all diplomatic channels. Our patience has limits. We will respond decisively. There was a strange pause afterward, like even the air had inhaled. And then the studio analyst came on, nodding, saying, the people needed to hear that. I looked at the television, at the words scrolling across the bottom. Breaking, nation prepares for possible military action. I didn't finish my dinner. Still, even with all that tension, I didn't think it would happen. Not really. It felt like theater. Like a game of chess where the kings glared at each other across the board but never moved. We'd seen these cycles before. Tensions rise, harsh words are exchanged, sanctions get tossed around, and then somehow, quietly, things de-escalate. That's what diplomacy was for, wasn't it? But then came the draft bill. Parliament passed it in a single day, extraordinary powers to the executive branch for the protection of sovereignty. No debate. No dissent. And the moment that ink dried, everything changed. The streets were filled with military trucks. Checkpoints appeared overnight. Men in uniform at train stations. There was a hum in the air, like a machine being turned on. I could feel it thrumming under my skin. And suddenly, Every billboard in the city said the same thing. Answer the call. Protect the nation. We need you. I remember standing at a bus stop, watching one of those recruitment ads play on a digital screen. It showed a soldier silhouetted against a sunset, holding the flag high, a child looking up at him with wonder. The words that followed, "Make your sacrifice count," landed like a punch in the gut. It was beautiful, manipulative, effective, and I hated how much I wanted to be that soldier. I was just out of college, weighed down by a degree I couldn't use, job prospects that went nowhere, and a nagging sense that I was wasting my time. Everyone I knew was drifting, bartending, delivering groceries, crashing on couches. But the war offered something that nothing else did: clarity, direction, purpose. So when I walked into the enlistment office, I wasn't angry or scared. I was numb. Like I'd already made the choice weeks ago and was just now catching up to it. The man behind the desk smiled like a salesman who knew he'd already closed the deal. He didn't pitch anything. He didn't have to. He just asked me to fill out the form, and then he handed me a pen like it was a weapon. That night, I told my mother. Her face went pale. She didn't cry at first, she just stared at the table, as if trying to find the right words in the grain of the wood. "I don't want to lose you," she finally whispered. "You won't," I lied. But I think part of her already knew. She'd seen the signs, the same as I had. And unlike me, she hadn't fallen for them. Training started a week later. They bussed us out to a dusty compound surrounded by fencing and steel towers. Inside, everything moved on a schedule, strict, merciless. We rose before dawn, drilled until our muscles screamed, memorized protocols, disassembled and reassembled rifles until our fingers bled. They stripped us down, not just our clothes and hair, but our names, our doubts, our questions. "You're not civilians anymore," our drill sergeant bellowed. "Your weapons." We shouted our affirmations. We obeyed. Because that's what we were there to become. But at night, lying in a bunk too short and too stiff, staring at the cracked ceiling, I sometimes wondered, if we were weapons, who was wielding us? And for what? That question didn't leave me. It followed me through every push-up, every march, every gunshot fired at targets shaped like men. Because the truth was, we still didn't know why we were going to war. We only knew that we were. The rest? That was classified. That was above our pay grade. But the machine was already rolling forward. The gears of war had been set in motion, not by monsters, but by polished shoes in high offices, by pens and contracts and strategy memos. And me? I was just one of thousands, uniformed and ready, standing at the edge of something vast and irreversible, convinced, like so many before me, that I was about to become part of something greater. We hadn't yet crossed the border, but the seed had sprouted, and soon it would bloom in fire. We were deployed to the eastern ridge under a sky the color of spent ash, a dull gray canopy that seemed to press down over everything like a great, silent weight. It was the kind of sky that never changed, not even when the sun rose. It just became a lighter shade of lifeless. That's the first thing I remember. The stillness. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Even the wind had gone somewhere else. No birds, no insects, just the groan of worn-out engines and the scrape of boots on hard ground. There was a strange quiet in the air, not peace, never peace, but the kind of eerie calm that you only notice when something is just about to break. They had told us the ridge was strategic. That's the word they used in the briefing. Strategic. A word that makes you think of high ground advantages and lines on a map. But when we got there, it just looked like a stretch of barren land scattered with broken rocks, dry brush, and the occasional ruined structure that might have once been a home, or a school, or something human. There was no sign of life, yet everything felt alive. Like the land itself remembered things it didn't want us to know. We set up camp in what used to be a small village. At least, that's what the satellite images suggested. Now it was little more than a cluster of crumbling walls and blackened beams. The air smelled of old fire, not fresh but deeply embedded, like the bones of the building still carried the smoke. We didn't talk much. Orders were given, and we followed. There were trenches to dig, equipment to place, perimeter to secure. Everyone moved with the quiet urgency of people trying not to think too hard. That's how you survive the first few days. You don't think. You just do. I remember the weight of my gear, the way my rifle pulled down on my shoulder, how the vest made it hard to breathe when I knelt. Everything felt heavier than it should. Not just the equipment, but the space around me. The way people looked at each other, the glances exchanged when the sun started to sink and the shadows stretched out like they were reaching for us. We were told to keep watch in shifts. Don't let your guard down, the sergeant barked. Eyes open. Rifles ready. The first night, I barely slept. None of us did. You could hear the creaking of tents in the wind, the rustle of footsteps outside, the occasional crackle of static on the radio. Every sound felt like a gunshot in your chest. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I tried to remember the last time I felt safe, but the thought slipped away, unreachable. By the third day, we were sent out on a patrol. Just a simple sweep through the ravine northeast of camp. The brass said it was routine. No confirmed enemy activity in the sector. But everyone knew what that meant. It meant we don't know. So we moved out at dawn, the air still cold enough to sting your lungs. I was third in line, sandwiched between Reyes and Karim, two guys I had trained with but barely knew. In war, familiarity doesn't always come from time, it comes from shared fear. The ravine twisted like a scar through the landscape. It was narrow in places, wide in others, bordered by jagged outcrops that created endless blind spots. Every corner felt like it might be the last. The silence was worse than noise. It played tricks on your mind, made you imagine footsteps behind you, whispers in the wind. I kept my rifle up, my eyes scanning every rock, every patch of dry earth. My hands were sweating despite the cold. Then it happened. The first shot rang out like lightning. A crack from a buzz. I saw the dirt jump near Reyes' feet before I even registered the sound. We hit the ground instantly. Training kicked in before thought. I dove behind a boulder, my heart punching my ribs, ears ringing, mouth dry. Bullets tore through the air, chewing into the rocks and sand around us. I shouted something, I don't even know what. Orders? A name? A curse? Reyes went down, hit in the shoulder. He fell with a grunt and started dragging himself behind cover, blood already darkening his sleeve. The squad returned fire, bursts of deafening noise echoing through the ravine. I crouched low, peering around the edge of the rock, finger tight on the trigger, scanning for movement. And then I saw him. Just for a second. A figure behind a half-collapsed wall up on the ridge. Not in uniform, just dark clothing, something slung over his shoulder, a glint of metal in his hand. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I squeezed the trigger. Once. Twice. 3 times. He dropped. Limp. Silent. My rifle lowered before I realized it. My breath came in short, uneven gasps. The gunfire around me continued, but my focus had tunneled to that one shape lying still in the dirt above. The firefight ended within minutes. Our squad regrouped, dragging Reyes back toward camp while providing cover. A drone buzzed overhead, relaying images to command. No further threats detected. We were clear. That's the word they used. Clear. Like what just happened was nothing more than a glitch in the mission. I followed the others in a daze, my boots crunching over gravel, my rifle still warm in my hands. Later, When the sun was high and the dead enemy combatant had been recovered, I saw him again. He was young. No older than me. Maybe younger. Thin, unshaven, his face slack in death. No armor, no insignia. Just a tattered jacket and a bracelet of red thread around his wrist. The object in his hand wasn't a weapon. It was a radio. That's when the numbness set in. Not guilt. Not right away. Just emptiness. The kind of hollow you feel when something has been taken from you, but you're not sure what. That night, I sat on an ammo crate behind the tent and stared at my hands for hours. They were shaking. I didn't notice it at first. The memory of his face kept replaying in my mind, not in horror, but in confusion. Who was he? What was he trying to say? Did he even see me? No one brought it up the next day. No one asked how I was doing. Someone clapped me on the back, said, "Good work," and handed me a protein bar. I nodded, muttered thanks, and bit down even though I wasn't hungry. That's how it was. That's how it always was. The kill was noted in the daily report. One less hostile. One more box ticked. But I didn't forget. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice things. How the enemy was always nameless, faceless. How our objectives were always changing, but our orders never questioned. How we patrolled villages that looked abandoned but felt lived in. How the locals stared at us, not with hate, but with something colder, disappointment. Fear. Resignation. And through all of it, that first moment, that first kill, hung in my mind like smoke. Not because it was particularly brutal. Not because I felt like a murderer. But because it was so easy. Too easy. A twitch of the finger and a life disappeared. And I had felt nothing. That scared me more than anything else. More than bullets. More than death. It was the first time I realized what the war was turning me into. And I was just getting started. In war, the loudest moments are often not the gunfire or the explosions, they're the silences that follow. Those long stretches of stillness, broken only by the click of a lighter, the creak of worn boots, or the rustle of a page being turned in a notebook. It was in those moments that I came to know Amir. Not in the chaos of combat, but in the cracks in between, when the world felt eerily paused, like it was holding its breath. Our friendship, or whatever you'd call the bond that forms between two men in a place where nothing feels real, wasn't born from shared experiences or laughter. It was born out of necessity. When you're in a trench for weeks on end, buried in cold mud and questions, you either talk or you go mad. Amir chose to talk. I chose to listen. I remember the first time he really opened up to me. We were sitting near the perimeter line, our boots half buried in the dirt, rifles slung low, the moon dull behind a curtain of clouds. It was quiet, too quiet. That kind of silence that feels like the earth is waiting to exhale. He pulled out his notebook and flipped it open to a page filled with tiny sketches. Not of people or landscapes, but of shapes, arrows, grids, dotted lines, a language I didn't understand. "These are patterns," he said, tapping the page with his pen. "Movements, supply drops, trade convoys. Not ours, theirs. You start to notice things when you've been around long enough. Timing, resources, routes. There's a rhythm to all of it." I looked over, trying to make sense of the diagrams. "You think they're planning something?" "No," he said with a small smile. "I think we are. Or rather, the people above us are. You don't flood a region with troops because of one border dispute. You do it because something valuable is beneath the soil. Or because your allies need a show of strength. Or because someone in a suit drew a circle on a map and decided they wanted it." I didn't reply. Part of me didn't want to believe him. But another part, a growing, restless part, couldn't ignore how easily his words fit with everything I'd been seeing but hadn't yet put into words. I started paying attention differently after that. I began to notice things I hadn't before, the way certain missions were timed with visits from foreign delegates, how reports were rewritten before being sent to command, how suddenly we'd shift focus from defensive patrol to territorial sweep without any explanation. It was like peeking behind the curtain of a play you thought was real, only to realize the script had been written in advance, and you'd been cast in a role without your consent. Amir was the first person to call it what it was. He said it one night in a whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "This isn't a war," he said. "It's a performance. And we're the instruments. War is just politics, soaked in blood." The words hit me like a punch. I'd heard phrases like that before, but always from the mouths of people who'd never held a rifle, who'd never seen someone breathe their last into the dirt. But Amir had. He'd lived it. He still did. And yet he refused to turn off that part of himself that questioned, that thought, that cared. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a historian, a reluctant philosopher in a world that wanted him to be quiet and obedient. One night, during a lull between rotations, he showed me a page from his notebook I hadn't seen before. It wasn't a map or a strategy. It was a quote. He'd copied it in neat handwriting. "War is merely the continuation of politics by other means." I stared at it for a long time. It didn't make complete sense to me then, not in the way it does now, but I could feel the weight of it. The truth pressing against the edges of my understanding like a bruise. "That's Clausewitz," Amir said. 19th century Prussian general. People misinterpret him all the time. They think he glorified war. But what he was saying, it's more cynical than that. He saw war for what it really is, just another tool for those in power. A tool that costs lives. I asked him why he carried that quote with him. He looked down at his notebook, thumb tracing the edge of the page. "Because it reminds me that none of this is personal. The hatred, the killing, the destruction, it's not born out of some ancient grudge. It's designed, engineered. It starts with people in boardrooms making decisions that will never affect their children. It ends with people like us pulling the trigger." He paused, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not weakness, just weight. The weight of knowing too much and being powerless to stop any of it. "I used to believe we were fighting for something noble," he said. "But now I think we're just occupying space someone else wants. And we're doing it in the name of safety, or freedom, or whatever word they think sounds best in the press release." His words didn't make me angry. They made me quiet. Because deep down, they echoed things I'd already started to feel but hadn't dared to give shape to. I remembered the look on that radio operator's face as he fell. I remembered the silence in the village after we cleared it. No resistance, no weapons, just empty homes and eyes watching from behind shattered windows. And I started to wonder, who had we actually protected? Who had we liberated? But the next day, the orders came in, and we were on the move again. That's the thing about war. Just when you think you have time to breathe, it yanks you back into the rhythm. March, deploy, patrol, report. And the thinking? The questions? You bury them. You tell yourself you'll sort it out later, when it's over. But it's never really over. Amir was transferred shortly after that. I helped him pack his gear. He left behind a few things, old gloves, a broken pen, half a chocolate bar. But he also left me his notebook. Just pressed it into my hands as he shouldered his rifle and said, "Maybe write your own pages in there someday. Maybe someone will need to read them." I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I would see him. His convoy hit a landmine 2 weeks later. We weren't even told until days after. There was no ceremony. Just a message, a closed casket, and his name added to a plaque no one will read. But I read his notebook. Over and over. And in those pages, I began to see the war differently, not as a battlefield, but as a chessboard. A place where people like us moved under the illusion of purpose, while the real game was played far from blood and dust. And ever since that day, I haven't stopped asking. If war is politics by other means, then who are we fighting for? And who, in the end, are we really fighting against? The day we finally crossed the border remains etched in my memory, not because of the drama one might expect, but precisely because of its unsettling ordinariness. It wasn't a thunderous charge or a battle cry echoing across the hills. Instead, it was a slow, grinding advance, the cold air seeping through every layer of clothing, chilling the bones and settling deep into the heart. The sky hung low and heavy, an oppressive blanket of gray that dulled colors and muffled sounds, making the world seem muted, as if the land itself were bracing for something unspeakable. I remember the crunch of frost beneath my boots, the harsh rhythm of 1,000 steps moving forward in unison, the synchronized breathing of men and machines pushing across a line that had been drawn decades ago on maps and signed away in distant chambers. The border was marked by nothing grand, just a crooked metal sign, half-tilted and rusted beyond recognition, warning passers-by of a restricted area. It might have been easy to miss, if not for the feeling that hit me when I saw it, a sharp, almost physical jolt, as if the invisible thread tethering one world to another was severed at that precise moment. Beyond the sign stretched a patchwork of empty fields and winding dirt roads, interspersed with the broken shells of homes that once sheltered families, laughter, and life. The windows were gaping holes, jagged and empty, as if the houses themselves had been gutted of their souls. Fences hung askew, twisted metal and splintered wood telling silent stories of lives abruptly torn apart. There was no welcome party, no grand battle or heroic charge. Instead, the air was thick with a quiet so profound it felt almost sacrilegious, the kind of silence that presses in on you, amplifies every small noise, and magnifies the pounding of your own heart. The war had crossed the border, but all I saw was the stillness of a world paused, waiting for the next move. Our orders were simple and brutal: secure strategic points, establish checkpoints, prepare for hostile engagements. But simplicity in orders never means simplicity in execution, or in the soul. As we moved deeper into that land, every step felt heavier, not just because of the gear weighing us down, but because of the growing weight of uncertainty. We were invading a place filled with people, not enemies, but mothers and fathers, children and elders, farmers and teachers. Real lives, complicated and fragile, intersecting with our own in ways I could not yet grasp. The villages we passed through were ghostly. Streets lay empty, save for the occasional stray dog wandering with cautious steps, noses to the ground, as if trying to trace the scent of those who had fled. The buildings bore the scars of conflict, bullet holes peppered walls like macabre decorations, doors hung off hinges or were completely missing, windows shattered and glazed with grime and dust. The stench of smoke and decay clung to the air, mingling with the earthy scent of frost and cold rain. I wondered often where the people had gone. Had they fled in terror? Were they hiding in cellars, watching our every move with fearful eyes? Or had some already become casualties of a war they neither started nor understood? Nights were the hardest. We camped near one such village beneath a sky so vast it felt indifferent to the suffering below. The stars were cold pinpricks in the black expanse, their distant light unable to penetrate the thick cloud of smoke and sorrow that hung over the land. Around the crackling campfires, conversations were sparse and subdued. Some men spoke of home, their voices rough and cracked with longing. Others stayed silent, lost in thoughts too, painful or complex to voice. The few words exchanged were laced with fatigue and the unspoken knowledge that none of us truly believed in the cause that had brought us here. During one of my guard shifts, I found myself wandering to the edge of our perimeter, the cold gnawing through my gloves as I stared into the darkness beyond our lights. The land stretched out in shadowy folds, hiding secrets I feared but longed to understand. I thought about the speeches we had heard, the rhetoric about defense, honor, sovereignty, all of it feeling like a distant script, recited by men far removed from the mud and fear of this place. The war was supposed to be about protecting our people, but all I saw was desolation, and I questioned who was really being protected. That night, near a broken fence post, I stumbled upon a fragment of paper half buried in the dirt. It was a letter, damp and stained, the ink smeared but still legible enough to read hurried, heartfelt words. It spoke of yearning for peace, of a family divided by conflict, of hope that the violence would end soon so children could return to school and fields to be sown again. Holding that fragile piece of someone's life in my hands, the war's reality hit me harder than any bullet. For all its grand political declarations, it was here, in this torn scrap of paper, that I saw the true cost, real human lives, fractured and fragile, caught in a storm far beyond their control. In the days that followed, patrols became routine, but every mission felt heavier than the last. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and I watched comrades grow quieter, their eyes duller, as exhaustion and disillusionment seeped in. The war was no longer a story of right and wrong, but a tangled, shifting maze of interests and survival. Crossing that border had been a physical act, but it marked something deeper, the crossing of innocence, the shattering of belief, the dawning of a grim understanding. We stepped into a land where politics seeped into every blade of grass, every cracked wall, every whispered prayer. The war was no longer about territory or victory. It was about control of land, resources, narratives, and ultimately, the very humanity of those who lived through it. As I stood watch beneath that indifferent sky, the weight of all I had seen settled into my bones. The battle was no longer just fought with guns and bombs. It was fought within us, between our duty and our conscience, between the truth we were told and the truths we lived. And in that quiet, cold night, I realized the war's most profound front was not the land we crossed, but the fragile boundary between obedience and understanding that we each struggled to maintain. The days that followed our crossing became a relentless blur, a disorienting cycle of patrols, briefings, and restless nights that bled seamlessly into one another. Time lost its usual markers. There were no mornings or evenings, just the dull progression of light and shadow. Each day was measured by the weight of my gear, the ache in my muscles, and the ever-present tension in the air. The landscape around us seemed indifferent to the turmoil we carried. Barren hills scarred by shellfire, trenches dug deep into the earth like open wounds, and villages that seemed caught in suspended animation, silent, empty, yet still whispering the echoes of lives interrupted. I felt caught in a strange duality. Part of me remained the soldier I had trained to be, a cog in the vast machinery of war, conditioned to obey orders without hesitation, to move as a single unit toward a goal I was told was just and necessary. But another part of me, the part that wasn't bulletproof, grew heavier with every passing day. I began to see beyond the tactics and strategies, beyond the sterile language of military communiques, into the human cost hidden beneath. Every checkpoint we set, every village we'd secured, felt less like a step toward peace and more like a tightening grip, a machine fueled by fear and political ambition grinding inexorably onward. Encounters with the local people were fleeting but searing. Faces peered cautiously from behind cracked doors and shuttered windows, eyes wary and weary, haunted by what had come before and what might come next. Children, far too young to comprehend the conflict enveloping them, sometimes watched from doorways clutching tattered toys or worn shoes, symbols of a childhood stolen. I wanted to believe we were protecting them, that our presence was a shield against chaos, but increasingly, that belief felt like a fragile veneer over a much darker reality. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and the political rhetoric seemed to drown out the voices of the people whose lives were irrevocably altered. One afternoon, while patrolling a narrow dirt road lined with ancient olive trees, we stumbled upon an elderly man sitting quietly on the crumbling steps of his home. His hands trembled as he held a faded photograph, edges curled and colors faded by years of touch and sun. When I approached, he lifted his eyes to mine, filled not with anger, but with a profound resignation, a silent accusation that cut deeper than any weapon. No words were spoken, yet in that fleeting exchange, I felt the crushing weight of war's true devastation. It was not only the shattered buildings or scorched earth, but the erosion of trust, the breaking of communities, and the fracturing of souls. That night, I lay awake beneath the canvas of my tent, staring at the damp fabric ceiling, the the image of that old man burned into my mind's eye. I thought of the speeches from faraway leaders, promises of defense, honor, and sovereignty, but their hollow cadence rang discordant against the backdrop of shattered homes and haunted gazes. I began to question the narrative I'd been handed, the story casting us as heroes and the others as villains. What if we were simply pawns, moved around by forces too vast to comprehend? The war revealed itself not as a series of heroic clashes, but as a relentless cycle, action and reaction spiraling endlessly. Every strike met with retaliation, every claim of justice shadowed by counterclaims, every victory marred by fresh losses. Politicians spoke of ceasefires and peace talks while bullets tore through the night and civilians bore the consequences. I struggled to reconcile lofty ideals with the grim reality, strategic objectives with the human toll. Amidst growing disillusionment, the bonds with my comrades became my anchor. We shared stories, fears, and rare moments of dark humor that punctuated the bleakness. Laughter flickered briefly like fragile flames in the darkness, reminding us that beneath the uniforms were men still clinging to remnants of hope. Yet even in these moments, shadows of doubt lingered, unspoken questions, private battles fought in silence. I saw it in their eyes too, the slow dimming of belief, the quiet erosion of certainty. One night, after a patrol thick with tension, I found myself beside Malik, a fellow soldier whose steadiness had become a source of comfort. Sitting by the dying embers of a fire under a canopy of indifferent stars, I asked, "Do you ever wonder why we keep going?" He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering, "Because if we stop, someone else takes our place. It's not about winning anymore. It's about surviving one more day." His words echoed deep within me. Survival had eclipsed ideals and strategies. The war was no longer about justice or freedom, but about enduring. Slowly, I understood the war's true nature, not only a conflict of weapons, but of politics, power, and unyielding ambition. Every decision on the battlefield was intertwined with agendas far removed from the mud and blood. The front lines were extensions of boardrooms and backroom deals, with soldiers like us executing consequences we never chose. This realization brought no comfort, only a profound sense of responsibility and helplessness. How could I reconcile being a soldier with knowing I was an instrument in a ruthless game? How could I find meaning in actions shaped by forces beyond my grasp? Yet, despite the doubts, the war raged on, relentless, unforgiving, and so did we, caught in the ceaseless cycle of politics by other means, walking the thin line between obedience and conscience, between duty and truth. The weeks stretched into months, each day melding indistinguishably into the next, and the war became a relentless shadow, suffusing every corner of my existence. The initial surge of adrenaline, the sharp clarity that had come with crossing the border, that sense of purpose and mission, slowly dissolved into a numbing routine. It was a slow, grinding erosion, not just of my body but of the very core of who I thought I was. Each morning I woke to a biting chill that seeped through my layers of fatigues, the cold a constant reminder of the unforgiving world we now inhabited. The war was no longer about grand strategic victories or clearly defined enemies. It had transformed into an unyielding test of endurance and willpower, where simply making it to the next dawn was both a triumph and a torment. I became consumed by the spaces between action, the long, agonizing stretches where the guns fell silent but my mind raced unchecked. In those moments, the abstract ideals of politics and national security, the rhetoric from leaders far removed from this battlefield, felt hollow and distant. Yet their consequences were etched in every scarred face, every ruined village, every whispered tale of loss we encountered. Slowly, painfully, I began to understand that the war was a living, breathing entity, shaped as much by decisions made in climate-controlled rooms thousands of miles away as by the bullets fired on these hills. My life, and the lives of my comrades, were little more than fragile threads in a vast tapestry woven by invisible hands. This truth settled heavily on my chest, a weight that was impossible to shrug off. One afternoon, while on patrol along a jagged ridge that overlooked a small valley, I spotted a cluster of children playing near the crumbling remains of a village that had once thrived. Their laughter, high and fragile, floated across the barren fields like a fleeting ghost of innocence amid the wreckage. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself the luxury of imagining a world untouched by conflict, a world where these children could run freely, their futures unburdened by fear or loss. But the illusion shattered instantly as a distant thunder rolled through the valley, a chilling reminder that peace here was nothing more than a fragile veneer, ready to crack at the slightest pressure. That evening, as we set up camp beneath a bruised, blood-red sky, I found myself sitting apart from the others, the cold seeping deep into my bones. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough canvas walls of our tent. In that quiet, lonely moment, my thoughts drifted inexorably back to Amir's words, spoken so long ago but echoing still: war is politics by other means. I could no longer deny the truth embedded in that phrase. The battles we waged were never solely about land or ideology. They were manifestations of political will, of power struggles played out using men like me as instruments and sacrifices in a game far larger than ourselves. This dawning awareness brought a new, sobering clarity. The war was not merely a contest of armies but a complex, brutal negotiation, an ongoing dialogue told through bursts of gunfire and prolonged silences. Every skirmish, every ceasefire, every shift in alliances was a sentence in a sprawling narrative that none of us could fully grasp. Yet within this grand story, individual lives were being shattered, dreams dashed, families torn apart, humanity stretched to its breaking point. As days bled into weeks, I grappled with the widening chasm between the orders I was given and the reality I witnessed. Each mission carried out, each command obeyed, seemed increasingly detached from the fragile lives affected on the ground. I watched comrades fall, some to enemy fire, but many more to exhaustion, despair, and the slow corrosion of hope. The sharp lines of right and wrong blurred into a haze of moral ambiguity, leaving me to question my place in a conflict where the rules shifted like sand, and the stakes were nothing less than human life itself. Yet amid the bleakness, moments of unexpected warmth and solidarity shone through. Sharing a cigarette under a canopy of indifferent stars, exchanging stories of distant homes and deferred dreams, these fragments of connection became lifelines, fragile threads of humanity that refused to break. They reminded me that beneath the uniforms, beyond the politics and violence, we were men trying desperately to hold on to our dignity, our sense of self, and our hope for something beyond the war. But the relentless tide of conflict showed no sign of ebbing. The political engines driving the war roared on, indifferent to the suffering etched into every face, every ruined street, every whispered prayer. The soldiers on the ground, my brothers in arms, were caught in the unending cycle, pawns bound by duty and circumstance. With every passing day, the truth weighed heavier on me. This was not a battle fought solely with weapons, but with hearts, minds, and the fractured souls of all caught in its grasp. And so, I continued, marching, fighting, surviving, walking the razor-thin line between obedience and conscience, between the soldier I was trained to be and the man I desperately hoped to remain. The war was not just a contest of arms. It was a crucible that tested every part of my humanity, forcing me to confront the devastating reality that beneath the flags and rhetoric, war was nothing more than politics writ in blood and broken lives. The longer I remained embedded in the war's unforgiving landscape, the more the sharp distinctions I once held between friend and foe blurred into a muddled haze of ambiguity. When I first stepped into this conflict, I was fueled by a fierce conviction that we were defenders of our homeland, champions of justice and order. But with every passing day, every patrol through abandoned streets, every glimpse into shattered homes, that certainty unraveled thread by thread. The people we were ostensibly here to protect bore the same haunted expressions as those we were told to consider the enemy. In many moments, their eyes wouldn't meet ours. Instead, they cast downwards, heavy with a weight of silent suffering, distrust, or weary resignation. It became painfully clear that beneath the banners, beneath the sharp lines drawn by ideology and uniform, this war was tearing apart communities woven together by decades, families divided, friendships fractured, neighbors turned strangers. One incident in particular carved itself deeply into my memory, a moment so raw and unsettling it forever altered my perception of the conflict's nature. We had received orders to secure a small farming village situated along a critical supply route. Intelligence suggested the presence of insurgent forces operating covertly among civilians. Our unit moved cautiously through the desolate streets, the silence oppressive as if the very earth held its breath. The villagers had fled in panic or were hiding in places unknown, leaving behind a haunting tableau of abandoned lives, broken furniture, scattered children's toys, half-packed bags on doorsteps. In one bombed-out house, beneath the rubble and splintered beams, I found him, a young boy no older than 10, trembling and huddled beneath a shattered table, clutching a battered, dirt-stained teddy bear as though it were a talisman against the chaos. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and glassy, swimming with a terror too deep for words. For a fleeting second, I saw my own childhood reflected back at me, the innocence stolen, the bewildering confusion of being caught in a storm far beyond his understanding. I wanted to reach down, to offer comfort or reassurance, but the weight of orders bore down: secure the perimeter, maintain vigilance, and move on. That frightened child's face haunted my thoughts long after we left that village behind. He became the emblem of every innocent caught in the crossfire of grand designs and political chess games, pawns displaced and sacrificed in conflicts scripted far from their homes. It was a searing reminder that war's veneer of valor and righteousness was often just that, a surface gloss masking raw human suffering. Beneath it all, war was about power, survival, and the unyielding will of those pulling strings from shadowed rooms. As I sank deeper into this grim reality, my faith in the mission eroded. The grand political narratives, liberation, defense, honor, felt increasingly hollow, rhetorical masks for a brutal contest of control. I saw factions maneuvering not for justice but for advantage, weaving alliances and betrayals like a twisted game of chess, where soldiers were but pieces to be sacrificed or deployed as needed. We became instruments, sometimes unwitting, sometimes resigned, in a struggle defined less by right and wrong than by shifting political winds. In conversations with my fellow soldiers, an unspoken truth began to surface. Many of us no longer fought for abstract ideals or distant causes. We fought to survive, to protect the men beside us, to cling to fragments of humanity in a world relentlessly stripped of it. The camaraderie forged in shared fear and hardship became our fragile refuge, a small light in the encroaching darkness. We shared whispered stories of home, of loved ones waiting in distant places, of futures paused or shattered. These connections were lifelines, fleeting but essential threads tying us back to a world that seemed increasingly unreachable. Yet, amidst the horror, I witnessed moments of profound and unexpected humanity. I recall vividly an evening when a local woman, risking everything, brought food and water to our checkpoint. Her face was lined with fatigue and quiet courage, her actions a stark contrast to the prevailing atmosphere of fear and suspicion. In that small act of kindness, I saw the resilience of the human spirit, a stubborn flicker of compassion burning even in the darkest corners. But such moments were painfully rare, flickering briefly before being swallowed by the ceaseless violence. The complexity of the war weighed heavily upon me. It was not a simple clash of good versus evil, but a tangled web of ancient grievances, political ambitions, and shifting loyalties. Every supposed victory was tempered by fresh losses, every advance shadowed by inevitable setbacks. Leaders spoke of peace talks and ceasefires, but on the ground, the fighting never truly ceased, and the civilians, those caught between these clashing forces, paid the highest price. As I navigated this fractured landscape, I came to understand that war was a language spoken in many dialects: politics, fear, violence, hope, despair, all woven into a tragic and unending chorus. It was a continuation of disputes that long predated the first gunshot, an ongoing conversation rendered in blood and broken lives. This realization did not bring solace. Instead, it deepened the weight pressing on my chest, the knowledge that I was a part of a vast, impersonal machinery driven by agendas far beyond my control was both humbling and terrifying. Yet even amidst this, I held on to a fragile hope that someday, beyond the smoke, beyond the rubble, there could be a different way. A world where conflicts might be resolved not by violence but by dialogue, where politics could reclaim its rightful place as the arbiter of disputes rather than their catalyst. Until that day, though, I was trapped in this cycle, marching forward on a path dictated by others, struggling to maintain the fragile line between duty and conscience, caught within a war that, at its core, was politics by other means. The months rolled on relentlessly, each day folding into the next without mercy or pause, until the war ceased to be just the backdrop of my life and instead became the life itself, an all-consuming presence that shaped every thought, every heartbeat, every breath I took. What had once been a sharp and burning sense of purpose, the clarity of mission that had propelled me forward when I first crossed that border, had long since been worn away, eroded by the ceaseless grind of violence, uncertainty, loss, and the slow corrosion of hope. I found myself trapped in a never-ending cycle of patrols and briefings, of nights spent staring into the indifferent darkness, wrestling with a tempest of questions and doubts that gnawed at my soul like invisible wolves. The simplistic narratives that had once seemed so real, of heroism, righteousness, and the defense of something sacred, began to unravel before my eyes. Instead, I saw a tangled web of motives, betrayals, shifting loyalties, and desperate survival. The clarity I once took for granted dissolved into a fog of ambiguity. The lines between right and wrong blurred into indistinct smudges. Every day, I was forced to confront the unsettling truth that the war we fought was not a battle between clear-cut good and evil, but something far more complicated, far more brutal. One cold, bitter evening, I sat beside a shallow fire that did little to stave off the chill creeping into my bones. The acrid scent of burnt wood mixed with the metallic tang of sweat and gun oil, wrapping around us like a grim reminder of the world we inhabited. Around me, my comrades were restless, some whispering quietly about the homes and families they'd left behind, others lost in silence so deep it seemed almost physical, a weight pressing down on the spirit. I looked out beyond our perimeter into the darkness, the landscape dotted with the skeletal remains of houses, shattered windows like empty eyes staring into oblivion, and fields scarred by craters and barbed wire. The war had transformed this land into a barren wasteland, and I felt it had transformed me too, shaped me into someone I barely recognized. It was during these long, haunted hours of silence and shadow that the true nature of our struggle gradually revealed itself to me, not as a noble battle for justice or freedom, but as a continuation of politics by other means. The battles we fought, the ground we gained or lost, the comrades we buried, it was all part of a larger political tapestry, woven far away from the trenches where we bled and suffered. Each gunshot echoed decisions made by faceless figures in distant offices. Every ceasefire reflected fragile agreements brokered in cold conference rooms. War was not an anomaly or a failure of diplomacy. It was a tool wielded deliberately by those in power to achieve aims that words and negotiations could not secure. I recalled, with a heavy heart, the faces of civilians caught in the crossfire, the old man clutching a faded photograph, the trembling boy beneath a broken table, the brave woman who brought us food despite the risks. Their suffering was not collateral damage or unfortunate consequence. It was the brutal, often willful outcome of political games played with human lives as the currency. The more I understood this, the more the idealistic justifications for war felt like thin masks, facades obscuring the raw and merciless reality where power and control were the ultimate objectives. Within the ranks, this growing awareness bred a complex mix of cynicism, exhaustion, and reluctant acceptance. Many of my fellow soldiers wrestled with the same doubts, their early enthusiasm replaced by a weary determination to endure, to survive another day. Our camaraderie, the bonds forged in fire and fear, became a fragile sanctuary, a shield against the forces that threatened to dehumanize us. Around flickering campfires, in hushed voices, we shared memories of home, whispered our fears, and clung to silent hopes that someday, somehow, this nightmare might end. And yet, amidst the darkness, moments of unexpected humanity pierced through like fragile shafts of light. I remember vividly the night a local woman, with nothing but courage and compassion, risked her life to bring us food and water at our checkpoint. Her face was etched with exhaustion and quiet bravery, an emblem of the resilience of the human spirit that refused to be extinguished even in the darkest times. But such moments were painfully rare, fleeting as shadows before the advancing night. The complexity of the war weighed on me like a boulder crushing my chest. It was not a simple contest of good versus evil, but a tangled web of ancient grievances, political ambitions, and fragile alliances. Every victory was tempered by fresh loss, every advance haunted by the threat of sudden reversal. Leaders spoke grandly of peace talks and ceasefires, but the fighting on the ground continued unabated, and the people, those caught between all sides, paid the heaviest toll. As I navigated this fractured terrain, I came to understand that war was a language with many dialects: politics, violence, fear, hope, despair, all woven into a tragic and unending chorus. It was a continuation of disputes and resentments that had simmered long before the first shot was fired, a brutal conversation conducted through blood and broken lives. This realization offered no solace. Instead, it deepened the weight on my shoulders, the crushing awareness that I was but a part of a vast, impersonal machine driven by agendas far beyond my comprehension or control. Yet, even amidst this grim reality, I held on to a fragile ember of hope, that beyond the smoke, beyond the ruin, there might one day be a different way. A world where disputes could be resolved not by violence and destruction but by dialogue, understanding, and respect. Until that day comes, though, I am bound to this cycle, marching forward on a path dictated by forces I can neither command nor change, struggling to preserve the line between duty and conscience, caught forever in a war that is, at its heart, politics by other means. The ruins stretched out before me like the remnants of a forgotten dream, buildings reduced to rubble, streets cracked and overgrown, and silent echoes of lives abruptly interrupted. Standing there, the devastation around me mirrored the turmoil within. Years of war had carved scars not only into the earth but deep into my own spirit. The faces of comrades lost, the haunting eyes of civilians caught in the crossfire, the constant cacophony of gunfire and explosions, all these memories swirled relentlessly in my mind. I had searched, perhaps naively at first, for meaning in the chaos, for answers to the questions that had gnawed at me from the very beginning. Why does man resort to such destruction? What purpose could justify the sacrifice of so many? Why must blood be spilled when voices could be raised instead? Now, after witnessing the brutal theater of war with all its rawness and contradictions, the truth crystallized with a piercing clarity that was both shattering and oddly liberating. War is merely the continuation of politics by other means. This was not a platitude or a distant theory, but a profound reality that shaped every skirmish, every battle, every decision made on both sides. It was a truth I had come to understand not through textbooks or speeches, but through the relentless living of it, the blood and sweat of men, the whispered fears intense, the anguished cries of the innocent. This insight did not come swiftly or easily. It was a gradual unfolding, an unpeeling of layers that revealed the cold mechanics behind the violence. I had seen how political ambitions, nationalist fervor, and strategic calculations, conceived far from the battlefield, dictated the fate of countless lives. Generals followed orders handed down by distant leaders, who themselves juggled alliances and power struggles beyond the comprehension of the soldier in the trenches. Ceasefires were brokered and broken with little regard for the human lives caught in the limbo. I saw that war was not merely the failure of diplomacy, it was sometimes the only language those in power chose to speak when negotiation failed or seemed too slow. Yet within that grim calculus lay a paradox that haunted me. War, terrible as it was a manifestation of human will, raw, unfiltered, and devastating. It was politics exposed in its most primal form, where words gave way to weapons and ideological battles were fought with bullets instead of debates. This brutal truth reminded me that power and ambition are forces so deeply embedded in human nature and society that conflict sometimes becomes inevitable. The battlefield was the crucible where these forces clashed, often at the expense of those who bore no real stake but whose lives were irrevocably altered. The faces of those I had met on this journey were etched into my memory with painful vividness. The boy clutching his battered teddy bear, eyes wide with a terror no child should know. The old man gripping a faded photograph, a silent testament to a life shattered. the woman who risked everything to bring us food and water, a fragile beacon of kindness amid desolation. Their stories were not mere footnotes or collateral damage. They were the living proof of war's terrible cost. These were the people who bore the true weight of political decisions, the human currency exchanged in a game whose rules they never agreed to. Yet even amid such devastation, moments of resilience and compassion shone through like faint stars in a stormy night. I witnessed soldiers sharing rare smiles, strangers extending hands in solidarity, and acts of quiet bravery that defied the darkness around us. These glimpses of humanity reminded me that, despite the machinery of war, the human spirit endures, a fragile but fierce flame that refuses to be extinguished. As I stood there, absorbing the full weight of my experiences, I understood the immense responsibility borne by those who hold political power. Their decisions ripple far beyond negotiation tables, shaping futures and destinies. The true path to peace, I realized, lies not on the battlefield but in the difficult, often messy realm of political discourse. It demands wisdom, patience, and a willingness to listen beyond rhetoric and fear. It requires leaders and nations to recognize the shared humanity beneath the divisions and to seek solutions that honor life rather than sacrifice it. I thought about the hope I once carried and the bitter lessons learned. I knew that while the cycle of violence might persist, there is always a possibility for change. History has shown that diplomacy can triumph when courage meets compassion, when dialogue replaces destruction. The challenge is immense, but the alternative, the endless repetition of war's horrors, is a burden too great for any generation to bear. And so, as I prepared to leave this scarred land behind, forever changed by what I had witnessed and endured, I carried with me a solemn conviction that transcended pain and loss. War is not the beginning of conflict, but its continuation through other means, a harsh, unvarnished truth that demands reckoning. It is both a condemnation of violence and a call to action, urging us to remember the human cost behind every strategic move, to seek peace with the tenacity and respect it deserves. This understanding, though born of suffering, planted a seed of hope, a hope that one day, the disputes that divide us might be resolved not with guns and bombs, but through understanding, empathy, and the fragile art of politics practiced with wisdom and humanity. Until that day arrives, the lessons of war must remain etched in our collective conscience, a stark reminder of what we stand to lose when politics chooses the path of violence.